Functionalism in architecture was a movement during the late 19th century and early 20th century. While there are certainly many sources and reasons for the fact that functionalism arose, we can attribute it in part to the American architect Louis Sullivan, who coined the term form follows function. In essence, Sullivan's quote meant that a structure simply expressed its purpose or function. Both in the United States and in Europe, functionalism and machine aesthetics were a response to modernization. The machine's influence on art and architecture reflected a kind of explosion about the idea of progress and the future, and this became very valuable as a form of aesthetic. And we've seen this already actually in some of our earlier lectures. If you think of Le Corbusier's "The house is a machine for living," the decision to have an engineer like Eiffel design the key monument for the Paris exhibition in 1851. So these are not brand new themes. However, the arrival of the machine had such a revolutionary significance that we sometimes call the early part of the 20th century the machine age. And among the great number of cultural changes engendered by this new era was the installation of a machine aesthetic in the fields of architecture and design. And this is central to the modern movement because it provided a means by which its practitioners could engage with what they regarded as the spirit of the age, the zeitgeist, a term that we know well by this point. The machine aesthetic can be distinguished in works of every major figure of modernist pantheon, and so we strongly associate it with modern architecture. There's some specific reasons for this in addition to the aesthetics, and this has to do with advances in construction techniques and materials science, and allows primarily for a shift in structural support. Whereas walls were once weight-bearing, so think of a Roman brick wall, for example, these had to be massive, right, if it's weight-bearing. Support now could be given by a skeletal infrastructure. This change provided greater flexibility in window placement and facade design, because before, windows could be nothing more than holes cut in walls, and now they could be located virtually anywhere. Thus, proponents of the international style, the architectural equivalent of machine purity, moved windows away from the wall's centers so that they would not suggest traditional construction, but would remind the viewer and user of the building that in fact this building has a skeleton, that those walls are not load-bearing. Machine purity was also a reaction against the ornamentation of the previous decades. Honesty in use and materials was sought. They needed to be expressive. Concrete should be used where concrete is best used. Metal, glass, likewise. Functions should not be concealed beneath any sort of covering. They should be revealed, and items shouldn't be presented as something they are not. A few other key themes that emerge with functionalism: simplicity and sterility. Stucco is an ideal material because it provides for an unbroken, continuous surface. Walls start to be considered as skins, stripped down, and this would allow for the maximum interior space. And then these interior spaces were to be designed individually, matching the needs of the residents. And finally, rooms were to be determined by function. And the movement between rooms is to stress the unity and continuity of the whole volume inside a building. On our Blackboard page, I've included a link to a clip from Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times of 1936. And in this clip, which I want you to watch, he parodies Ford's automated assembly line. So another theme here, the machine, you could see in this still here, Chaplin is sort of stuck in the gears, is that in addition to the benefits of the machine, the idea of progress and efficiency and high quality standards, we also have the negatives, the alienation, the removal of the human touch from the production of goods, and in architecture and art, from the overall design process. So this is kind of a fun clip that reminds us that while in some ways everything was great and this is very positive, there is this kind of negative undertone about what efficiency actually means to the individual. So Ford. One of the things that happens when we look at functionalism is this idea of the automobile, how the making of the automobile on an assembly line that could be very, very efficient, how some of those ideas could be replicated in other fields. Right? So, for example, Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson, they discussed European functionalism in their MoMA exhibition of 1932, and this is what they said. They said, quote, "If a building provides adequately, completely, and without compromise for its purpose, it is then a good building regardless of its appearance," unquote. So what they're saying is that, in fact, functionalism is not an aesthetic. Now, the explanation for this somewhat radical view is found in the machine. Since the machine's appearance was derived entirely from its function, it was both morally and economically admirable, and this makes it beautiful. Now, evidence of this kind of modernist approach we can see in many places, but one of them in particular, a sort of unself-conscious functionalism, is in Henry Ford. Ford brought the concept of standardization to his automotive plants with results that were seen at the time as truly astonishing. His moving meeting line system, which involved specialized stages of fabrication and identical parts, enabled him to dramatically increase car production. His success was such that industrialists and manufacturers across the world began to adopt the methods. Theoretically, any good, be it a car or a chair or maybe a house or building, were now readily available and continually improving, right? The idea that technology improves economy and availability. And so in architecture, the idea of standardization would permit and facilitate rapid construction, maintenance, and in theory, higher quality. One of the key areas where we see the direct impact of standardization is inside the home, so in the domestic sphere. And I hope you already have realized that 20th century architecture is marked by a huge focus on the domestic space. We've seen the housing shortages resulting in the construction of many new homes, and also thinking back to the Weissenhof-Siedlungen, that the home and the multifamily or single-family home becomes the focus of modernist design emphasis. This is something we've seen already. So this shouldn't be too surprising to you that standardization first really bears fruit within the home as well. So before there's Martha Stewart, there's Christine Frederick. She was an innovator, a scientific homemaker, and kitchen connoisseur. And from 1912 through 1940s, she focused on domestic efficiency at her Applecroft home experiment station in Green Lawn, New York. And her goal was to take modernizing homemaking to a new level. Christine Frederick was married to J. George Frederick, who was an advertising executive. And she became really fascinated with her husband's discussions about Taylorism, a type of scientific management system created to efficiently run labor in factories. In Taylor's studies, stopwatches and charts served as a means to study motion and to see where new efficiencies could be found in manufacturing processes. Christine Frederick, trying to break away from her mother's Victorian-era notions on how to run and organize a household, decided to apply these same scientific principles to domestic housework and cooking. She often stated that she was weighed down with drudgifying labor, especially after the birth of her 2 children. When the Frederick family moved from the Bronx to an old apple orchard in Green Lawn in 1912, Christine Frederick established what she called the Applecroft Home Experiment Station, and it was here that she ultimately launched her career as a writer. And her goal was, in a series of 4 articles in the Ladies' Home Journal, was to talk about efficiency studies in the home. And this led ultimately to the publication of a book called The New Housekeeping Efficiency Studies in Home Management, which was published in 1913. In her journalistic writings and her books, she acted as a kind of home consultant to the middle-class American housewife on how the household could be run more efficiently. In her book, Frederick wrote in her preface that despite the fact that she, quote, liked housework and was especially fond of cooking, unquote, she never seemed to get anywhere and had very little free time. She set out to change that and to help other women in the process. She started out by showing through the use of diagrams the most efficient way of arranging kitchen equipment. She rid herself of the old Victorian pantry and instead set up storage near food preparation areas. She believed that shelving should only be 1 item deep to avoid needless reaching and searching of items. As far as household devices and tools, they were grouped into 4 categories. These were fuel savers, step savers, labor savers, and time savers. For instance, Frederick recommended using a dish drainer that would allow dishes to dry themselves, a stationary egg beater to prevent wasted motion, and long-handled dustpan to avoid stooping. Through her use of timers and stopwatches, she concluded that it takes 7 minutes to chop a pound of meat using a wooden board and knife. A meat chopper would chop 3 pounds of meat in 1 minute, thus saving time and energy. Frederick even went as far as to match the proper counter height to the height of the homemaker. And so here you can see some of the diagrams that she made. And the key thing with Christine Frederick is that she was thinking of the kitchen as a factory. So the idea of functionalism and machine efficiency is applied here to a very domestic residential scale. And this kitchen as a sort of laboratory, and she used this sort of sterile scientific management ideas on very sort of humble everyday doings. Just in case you're thinking that this seems a little bit humdrum, I should mention that her book was translated into 6 languages and was hugely popular. One of the people that her book reached was Margaret Schutt-Lehotsky, who you will remember worked on the Frankfurt kitchen. And just a little reminder of the work that she did there. She was focused on functionalism in apartment complexes. So the design of the Frankfurt kitchen in Romerstadt used Taylorism and the Frederick writings, the idea of time motion studies, to develop and refine the kitchen to its sort of purest, smallest, and most efficient form. So Lehotsky, like Frederick, wanted to ease women's domestic labor so that they had more time and energy for professional life or perhaps an inner spiritual development. But from the work of people like Frederick and Lehotsky, there are numerous other examples of how functionalism, Taylorism, Fordism had an effect on architecture and related fields. I'm just showing you a couple of images here now from Ernst Neufert's Building Design Handbook. This was first published in 1936, and we still have this book today, of course, in revised editions. What these books do is they start to lay out standards, right? The best height for this, the best width for that. Doors should be this. This is the standard bedroom size. A powder room can be no smaller than this, etc., etc. And the goal was, through these kinds of manuals, was to establish a minimum standard and to help raise the quality of design overall. And here's some other examples. In this case, you'll notice it's the human figure looking at space requirements in design. So whereas Frederick and Lohotsky looked specifically at the kitchen, books such as Neufert's looked much further. The kitchen was just one focus. We also have bedrooms, industrial spaces, etc., etc. There are many more applications. And from this kind of work, we see the development of the field of ergonomics. The example of Ford and others encouraged the modernists to view the machine as an absolute ideal of functionalism. And this can be confirmed quite nicely by referring back to Le Corbusier. We've talked about him in previous weeks, but here again a bit of a reminder about his publication Version Architecture, Towards a New Architecture. And much of this book is dedicated to promoting the architectural virtues of the machine. His famous declaration, quote, "The house is a machine for living in," unquote, is often misunderstood. It's actually meant the guiding principles for architects should be to make the house as well suited to its purpose as the machine is to its. This reiterated the argument that functionalism was more important than appearance. In order for progress, Le Corbusier believed, it was necessary for architects to abandon the notion of traditional styles and decorative effects. Quote, "Architecture has nothing to do with various styles. They are sometimes pretty, though not always, and never anything more," unquote. This suggests that he saw aesthetics not just as another style, but as the very substance of architecture. Le Corbusier drew parallels between architecture and the engineer's aesthetic, arguing that engineers should be praised for their use of functionalism and mathematical order. As a consequence, architects were encouraged to emulate engineers and adopt these principles in order to attain harmony and logic in their designs. The illustrations in Version Architecture celebrate the functional and architectural unity of Canadian grain stores, ships, airplanes, and of course, automobiles. The Maison Domino is another early example of Le Corbusier's engineer aesthetic. 3 identical planes are suspended above each other by steel columns, a method of construction that frees the walls of their load-bearing purpose and allow his concept of the free facade to be introduced. An external staircase communicates between each level, and its location permits an unprecedented space and clarity in the plan. The components were all standardized and prefabricated, which would allow for rapid construction. The house is therefore a product of Le Corbusier's intention to apply the principles of mechanical mass production to, again, domestic architecture. This possibility was not fully explored until the influence of modernism had spread and produced a diversity of practitioners. To the increasingly machine-oriented Bauhaus, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy imparted his belief that the machine was inextricably linked with socialism because it was an absolute. He wrote, quote, "Before the machine, everyone is equal. I can use it, so can you. There is no tradition in technology, no consciousness of class or standing. everybody can be the machine's master or slave, unquote. This belief was widespread among the modernists, with Theo van Doesburg being another notable exponent. Van Doesburg praised the machine as a medium of social liberation and denied that handicraft possessed this capability, since handicraft, under the supremacy of materialism, reduced men to the level of machines. But as Charles Jenks has observed, Van Doesburg's enthusiasm for the machine went beyond its labor-saving potential. It was also based upon its, quote, universalizing abstract quality, unquote. In Jenks' outline, the machine's impersonality enforces equality between its users, which in art would lead to the universal and the abstract, instead of the personal and the specific. The result would be the realization of a collective style that was universally valid and comprehensible, based as it was upon the abstract forms of the machine. So from these different examples, and the idea from the domestic space of social management of the home, the domestic space being transformed from the Bauhaus and Moholy-Nagy and these other designers that we've seen, comes this idea of the scientific basis for architecture. The goal that architecture was not art, but mostly science. And so this quote from Colin Rowe is excellent to help remind us of this. Architecture was to have a firm scientific basis, but more than that, it was to take its inspiration from the rationalism and experimentation of sciences. And 4 elements of the functionalist doctrine emerge. 1. Integrity and usability of materials. 2. Expression of new construction technology and production methods. 3. Efficient use and organizing of buildings. And 4. Propagation of a new spatial order, free from references to the past. A truly wonderful example of this sort of scientific basis for architecture can be seen in the Maison de Verre designed by Pierre Charot in Paris. The Maison de Verre is translated as, quote, house of glass, unquote, is a milestone in early modern architectural design. It was built in 1932. The house uses various industrial and mechanical fixtures juxtaposed with the traditional style of home furnishings, all under the transparency and lightness of the facade. Unable to expel an elderly woman from the top floor, the house is embedded underneath an existing apartment. As such, the house uses a skeletal frame, so it's steel construction, and this allows a free plan and the use of lightweight materials such as glass and glass block to really enable this kind of idea of glass, right? The house of glass. An interesting aspect of this house is the ubiquitous mechanical fixtures. On the ground floor was a medical suite for the owner, Dr. Jean Delsach. This unusual circulation arrangement was resolved by a rotating screen, which hid the private stairs from the patients during the day, but framed the stairs at night. So again, it's sort of work-live housing, right? Except for quite a wealthy client. So very cleverly designed. Other mechanical components include an overhead trolley from the kitchen to the dining room, a retracting stair from the private sitting room to a bedroom, and a complex bathroom cupboards and fittings. Which, I'm sorry, you can see here on the right, there's the bathroom, and you get a sense just from the diagram of all these different moving panels, these different elements that switch and move and turn to other things. In fact, you can kind of see the Maison de Verre as a machine itself. I mean, this is architecture as kinetic art. Spatial divisions inside the home are customizable by use of sliding, folding, and rotating screens in glass, sheet, and perforated metal. The honesty of the materials, variable transparency of forms, and the juxtaposition of industrial materials and traditional home decor come together to make the Maison de Ville a true landmark in 20th century architecture. In this week's folder for lectures, I've included a link to a fascinating and very short documentary on this building. I encourage you to watch it and to look at the way the materials are used, to consider the idea of functionalism in how the machine operates, the home operates. Another interesting project is Paul Nelson's Suspended House. This was a speculative project. It was not built, but so interesting. As you can see here in the model, a continuous metal lattice defines the main volume of the house, and above which sits this roof, which is supported by a large steel frame. A simple concrete and glass block volume intersects the mesh enclosure, creating an interesting mezzanine and roof terrace. As you can see here, there's some sculptural elements that Nelson's added to the model. This project, with its open structural cage, is a pretty daring architectural experiment using the modernist concept of free plan. And here you can see another image of how the structure would sort of hang on those steel arches. So pushing the envelope of what was possible structurally and aesthetically. This project by Buckminster Fuller is the Dymaxion House. And some of you may have seen a Dymaxion house in the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn. This was a project, a sort of futuristic dwelling invented by the architect and practical philosopher Buckminster Fuller. The word Dymaxion, which combines the words dynamic, maximum, and tension, was coined by Fuller to describe the combination of functions coming together to create something truly novel. In 1920, Fuller wished to build a sustainable, single-family dwelling, the living machine of the future. Although it was never built in any number, the Dymaxion's design displayed forward thinking and influential innovations in prefabrication and sustainability. Not only would the house have been self-sufficient, but it also could have been mass-produced, flat packaged, and shipped throughout the world. Unfortunately, the idea seems to have been kind of prematurely abandoned. Perhaps people do not like round homes. It might have been very productive and useful, however, if it had reached its potential, especially for addressing post-war shortage of housing. And despite the fact, though, that it wasn't built extensively, the idea of using new materials, implementing sustainable technologies, and also the ease of its assembly and mass production did have a large influence on the architectural field. In April 1946, Fortune magazine suggested that, quote, the dwelling machine was likely to produce greater social consequences than the introduction of the automobile, unquote. While this has certainly not been the case, the principles of sustainability and his idea that, quote, more should be done with less, unquote, have had a pretty big impact on sustainable design today. One element that we have seen used, though again not in large distribution, is the bathroom unit. So he was worried, Fuller was worried by the poor sanitation, inefficiency, and high cost of bathrooms. So he came up with this solution in 1936. The 4 stamped metal sheet or molded plastic sections are each light enough to be carried by 2 construction workers. They can fit up quite tight staircases and through narrow doors, and would allow the retrofitting of existing structures. All of the appliances, pipes, and wires are built in, and so the on-site construction is just the hookup. With the sections bolted together, the interior has no germ-harboring nooks, crannies, grout cracks, or anything that can rot. Large radius corners make cleaning easy, and he also includes ventilation systems directly into the design of this bathroom unit. He also considered, very prematurely, the idea of living in place. So the sink and the bath shower are arranged not just for the easy care of children, but also of seniors. The mirror doesn't steam up, the sink doesn't splatter, and ultimately the toilet paper stays dry. Dymaxion bathrooms were equipped with a sort of fog gun hot water vapor shower that would only use a cup of water, and the goal was to be able to clean hygienically without soap. So a lot of emphasis on preservation of materials, so to be a sustainable steward. And here you can see an image of a prototype that was built. In conclusion, it needs to be emphasized that the varied interest in functionalism and the machine aesthetic were not mutually exclusive, and individual modernist architects looked to the machine aesthetic for ideological, practical, and utopian reasons. While some may criticize the modernist enthusiasm for the machine aesthetic as being purely ideological or aesthetic in nature rather than practical, as we've seen just in these few examples, there were architects who pursued the technological and functional on poetic and rational bases.